In 2008, the global financial system went into meltdown when an investment bank in New York called Lehman Brothers went bust. The ensuing crisis gave rise to the doctrine of too big to fail. Some institutions were thought to be so central to the financial system that if they were to go bankrupt as Lehman Brothers did, it could put the entire world economy at risk. The world economic system was interconnected. The effects of this crisis spread all over the world, and some say that we have yet to fully recover from it. But not many people know the origin of Lehman Brothers. When Lehman Brothers was founded by Bavarian immigrants to the United States in 1850, it wasn't an investment bank and was nowhere near as important as what it would become. The Lehman Brothers traded cotton, a product that was in high demand in the textile factories of the industrializing regions of the world, a product that was produced almost exclusively by enslaved labor, and the brothers owned slaves themselves. Even at that time, Lehman Brothers and the cotton trade were part of a web of an interconnected and globalizing economy. In his remarkable book, Empire of Cotton, the historian Sven Beckert argues that cotton and the slave labor that produced it were central to the emergence of the modern economy that we call capitalism. He explains how firms like Lehman Brothers operated. For a planter in Mississippi to provide cotton to a Manchester manufacturer, a local Mississippi merchant, a so-called factor, had to first provide the planter with credit to acquire slaves, land, and implements. This factor probably drew on London or New York bankers for these resources. Once the cotton had ripened, the factor would offer the cotton for sale to exporting merchants in the port of New Orleans. That merchant would sell it on to importing merchants in Liverpool, who would also provide insurance on the bales and organize their shipment. Once in Liverpool, the importing merchant would ask a selling broker to dispose of the cotton. As soon as a broker found the cotton to his liking, he would forward it to a manufacturer. The manufacturers would work up the cotton and then provide it to a merchant who would organize its shipping to a representative in a distant port, for example, Calcutta. Thus slave-grown Mississippi cotton, manufactured into yarn in Lancashire, England, might be wound into a shirt somewhere in the Indian countryside. The empire of cotton consisted of tens of thousands of such ties. Now, that was a long passage, and don't worry if you didn't quite follow all the dizzying details and the web of connections and middlemen involved. The point is not to memorize all of that. The main point I want to make is actually more simple, and it's that slave labor and the commodities it produced were nodes in a complex economic web that reached across the world. That slavery was bound up with trade, commerce, and the rise of the modern economic system we call capitalism, and that the vestiges of that history are still around us today. What impact did slave labor, especially in the Atlantic world, have on the development of the modern capitalist economy? This question has been the subject of an enormous amount of debate recently in the context of calls for reparations for slavery. Reparations advocates point out that the wealth of the powerful regions of the world today was built in large part on the backs of enslaved people, and they demand compensation for it. But what have historians said about this issue? Well, they disagree about it. Not only is this a controversial topic among historians, it's connected to an even larger historiographical debate about the origins of capitalism and the emergence of the modern economy. And both of those discussions are informed by a deep ideological debate about the definition and nature of capitalism itself. So that's the debate I'm going to introduce you to today. And given how controversial the question is, you won't be surprised to hear that I won't be able to settle the question. My goals are more modest. In this class, I want to do two main things. First, I want to introduce you to the historiographical and conceptual debate about the link between slavery and capitalism. I want to tell you what historians have recently been saying about this question, and I want to show you why they disagree about the answer. In keeping with the main theme of this course, my discussion will focus on the importance of interconnections between different regions instead of just looking at one country. The second thing I want to do is to introduce you to the legacies of British slave ownership website based at University College London. The documentary based on that site won the Royal Historical Society's Prize for Public History in 2015. The website itself is a wonderful example of digital and public history. I'm going to suggest that the tools they provide give new insight into the economic questions we're discussing. It's a great example of what digital and public history can contribute. This is, after all, of course, on slavery in public history. When you're done listening to this lecture, take a look at the list of questions I've sent through. They are designed to help you to get to know the website. But for now, let's focus on the lecture and the question of the link between slavery and capitalism. The question of the relationship between slavery and capitalism obviously has a lot to do with how you define capitalism. Many have argued, and some still argue, that slavery and capitalism are incompatible as a matter of definition. Capitalism, in their view, is defined by free markets, free trade, and free labor. Free, free, free. Slavery, some believe, was more associated with a system prior to capitalism called mercantilism or colbertisme, an economic doctrine that emphasized protectionism. After all, Adam Smith, one of the main advocates of capitalism and free trade, argued against slavery in his book, The Wealth of Nations. It was less efficient, he believed, than free labor. You could squeeze more out of a freely employed worker, he thought. But this optimistic view wasn't shared by everyone. Marx wrote a little bit about slavery in Das Kapital. He thought it played an important role in the period of what he called primitive accumulation, which preceded capitalism. Basically, in order for capitalism to take off in the first place, you need to amass a lot of wealth and organize a market system. This was accomplished by violence, conquest, slavery, the enclosure of common lands in Great Britain, and other things you may have heard about in your other courses. But Marxist analysis of capitalism focused mostly on the production of commodities by wage-earning laborers, and he focused a lot on what went on inside of factories, in industry. So slavery wasn't his main interest. When people talk about capitalism in history, there's a tendency to focus on industrial capitalism. Big machines and technologies, workers in factories with soot on their faces. But to me, it seems that capitalism as an economic system is first of all a way of producing and distributing goods and services. In other words, capitalism is not just about industry or the Industrial Revolution. It's a way of producing and distributing stuff. In a capitalist system, the things that are produced are commodities. The way things are produced is by putting together commodities with labor. And labor itself is seen as a commodity in this system. Labor and commodities are put together to produce new commodities for sale on the market for a profit. Commodities, 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 in other words, is what capitalism is about. So what's a commodity? Well, it's a good or a service that's produced with the express intention of being sold on the market. In capitalism, people are almost completely dependent for their livelihoods on things they buy and sell in the market. You all are trying to get jobs in the labor market so you can buy groceries in the supermarket. Now, this may sound obvious or silly, but consider that this way of doing things hasn't always been the dominant way of producing and distributing stuff. So when, for example, the Virginia company set up shop in America and later decided they wanted to grow tobacco for export to Europe, Native Americans weren't exactly lining up to take a job in this new business. You couldn't go out and hire people because there was no labor market, at least not in Virginia. The labor had to come from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Even today, a lot is produced in different ways to what I've just been describing. Scholars like Tithi Bhattacharya and Susan Ferguson have pointed out that there's a whole sphere of social reproduction in which work is done usually by women. GDP doesn't count all of that work being done. But of course, it's necessary for any economy to function, for human beings to survive. So for example, when your grandma bakes a cake, she's produced more stuff. She's putting more stuff into the system. You don't pay her a salary to do it. When she divides up the cake, when she cuts up the slices, gives them out, she's distributing the good that she has produced. But she doesn't auction off the biggest slice to the highest bidder. At least my grandmother doesn't do that. But it seems to me that taking this whole sphere of social reproduction into account is pretty important in general, but also when we're talking about slavery, considering all the domestic work that enslaved people did. As we'll see in later lessons, in the Indian Ocean world and in the Middle East, there was a preference for this type of enslaved labor. Not the plantations that we normally associate with slavery in the Atlantic world. But what about commodity production? Were enslaved people involved in the system of commodity production and distribution? Well, let's see. Enslaved people were treated as commodities. They were put to work on plantations whose express purpose was to produce commodities for markets abroad. The goods they produced were handled by joint stock companies. They were also thought of in accounting terms like cows and sugar mills, which had a monetary value. On the eve of the Civil War in the United States, the value of the slaves was more than all the factories and banks in the country combined. Enslaved people could be insured. They could be used as collateral for loans and mortgages. Next week, we're going to talk about Monticello, the great house of the American revolutionary and president Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the great words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Well, Monticello was built with the help of a loan that Jefferson took out right here in the Netherlands. The banker, Nicholas van Staaphorst, gave Jefferson a loan, and in order to secure it, Jefferson put up 17 of his people he held as slaves as collateral. So in my mind, we can't say that capitalism and slavery are incompatible by definition. But it's another matter to determine how important the Atlantic slave system was for economic growth. And the most influential person to write about this question was Eric Williams, a historian and later Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Eric Williams wrote the book Capitalism and Slavery, which was published in 1944 in the United States. Williams advanced a number of claims that were considered provocative at that time and still are today. Among those was the proposition that historians now call the Williams thesis, namely that the gains from slavery in the Caribbean were so great that they were a necessary condition for the rise of Britain as an industrial capitalist power. The link between the slave economy of the Atlantic world and the rise of industrial capitalism was thus an intimate one. Well, is that correct? Many historians have been very critical of that idea. Among them, David Eltis and Stanley Engerman, who argued that slavery and the slave trade was actually of marginal importance to the economy of Great Britain. Sure, there was a lot of money in the trade of sugar and sugar-related products in Britain in the 18th century, but other industries like iron and woolen textiles, for instance, were important also. That's what this table from their article tries to show. Using a counterfactual argument, a thought exercise in which you ask, what would have happened if a certain event had not occurred, they conclude that there would still have been an industrial revolution in Britain, even without slavery. Now here in the Netherlands, a controversy has also emerged between historians that relates to the Williams thesis. How important was slavery to the Dutch economy and how profitable was it? Of course, since the Netherlands industrialized much later than Britain and Belgium, these historians don't argue that slavery led to an industrial takeoff, but they still want to know how important it was to the economy. Two young Dutch historians, Karwan Fatah-Black and Matthias van Rossum, published an article challenging an older view about the importance of the trade in enslaved people. They argued that we need to change the method we use to calculate the impact of the slave trade. When looking at the impact of the slave trade, you have to look at the way this trade affected a whole bunch of other connected economic activities. The slave trade was a spur and a stimulus to all sorts of other areas of the economy, they claimed. For example, when you traded in slaves, you needed ships, so the slave trade could have provided a stimulus to the shipbuilding business. Wages needed to be paid out, and insurances were taken. Captains received bonuses, etc. But these young historians were criticized by representatives of the older view, among them David Eltis, who I just mentioned, and the historian Piet Emmer. They argued that the young scholars were wrong in their method of calculating the value of the slave trade. They insisted that you actually have to look at the profits of slave trading voyages. And if you do that, you'll see that they were actually rather small. Other sectors may have been more profitable and would also have had a stimulus effect on shipbuilding. They cite whaling as an example. And of course, in order to do whaling, you also need ships. Last year, Pepijn Brandon and Ulbe Bosma attempted to estimate the impact of the Atlantic slave-based activities on the Dutch economy between 1750 and 1800. So this meant not only looking at the slave trade, but the impact of things like sugar, coffee, and tobacco that enslaved labor produced. And they used a measure called gross domestic product, which is a well-known measurement in contemporary economics. What is gross domestic product? It's the measure of the monetary value of the goods and services produced in a particular economy. They claim that it was 5.2% of the economy of the Dutch Republic. 10% of the richest province, Holland, was based on slavery, and 19% of Dutch imports and re-exports was made up of goods produced by slaves in the Atlantic region. That was for 1770, which was a high point. Now, you might say that 5% doesn't sound like that much, but if you think that, then I'd invite you to give me 5% of what's in your bank account right now. So it seems to me that it's safe to say that slavery was important. Judging how important it was has a lot to do with the way we measure it. And in the notes for this class, you'll see several other articles that take different views to the ones I've described, somewhere along the spectrum between those who say that slavery was not that important and those who say that slavery was essential. Are a number of other historians who take other views that could be described as more of a middle ground. Among them, Barbra Solow, the famous Kenneth Pomeranz, David Inikori, and a number of other famous names. But a lot of these calculations in economic history are based on incomplete information and on estimates. The historical data isn't as clear and as complete as current day accounts are. But what about Great Britain, the original home of the Williams thesis, or at least the country that Eric Williams was talking about? How central was the labor of enslaved people and the commodities they produced to the economy of Great Britain? Well, I mentioned reparations earlier. Did you know that reparations were actually paid out, but to slave owners, not to the formerly enslaved? They were paid out when slavery was abolished in Britain, and also in the Netherlands and France, among other places. In Britain, the Slave Compensation Commission was set up by an act of Parliament, and it was authorized to make payments to former slave owners. In order to carry out this enormous project of wealth transfer, the commission had to come up with a way of valuing all the enslaved people, the so-called lost property, quote unquote. They made estimates of the average values of enslaved people in different regions of the Caribbean. Men were worth more than women and children, for example. The whole project cost a fortune, with 40% of the expenditure of the British government's budget being devoted to paying out this sum. Now, in order to get their money, slave owners had to fill out forms and mail them into London. All those forms and documents were collected and archived. The result was a huge list of slave owners and estimations of the monetary value of the people they held as slaves. Recently, historians at University College London, Nicholas Draper and Catherine Hall, decided to put all of this information into an easily accessible online database. And one of the articles you've been asked to read for today is written by Catherine Hall about this website. Now, these historians kept track of who received the money, where they lived, and where they may have invested the compensation. The result of their work is absolutely fascinating. The picture that this database paints is in many ways much richer and more complex than many of the quantitative studies I have just described to you. They found that slave ownership was widespread. The database showed that half of the compensation was paid out to people living in Britain, not in the Caribbean. They mapped out where these slave owners resided and what buildings they owned. The streets of Britain's cities were covered in dots indicating historic links to slavery. Their map even shows that many people here in the Netherlands received compensation. Money from slavery built great buildings and manor houses. Major financial institutions like Lloyd's of London and Barings Bank had links to slavery. The wife of David Cameron and even Benedict Cumberbatch were revealed as having had slave-owning ancestors. Money received from the commission was reinvested into imperial ventures abroad in India, Canada, and Australia. The researchers found that Sir John Gladstone, the father of the famous Prime Minister William Gladstone, received the equivalent of £80 million today. So what did he do with all that money? Well, he invested it in the Industrial Revolution. He and his son invested millions of pounds in the construction of the Grand Junction Railway, a line that connected the port of Liverpool to factories in Cheshire and Lancashire, where cotton grown by enslaved people in Mississippi and financed by firms like Lehman Brothers was turned into thread that could be exported to Calcutta. Thank you.